Ja, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Studierende, ich darf meiner Freude Ausdruck geben, dass es gelungen ist, wieder eine prominente Professorin in dem Fall, nachdem wir jetzt schon eine Kollegin aus Trondheim hatten, eine Kollegin aus Budapest hatten, heute eine Kollegin aus Rom Ihnen vorzustellen. Es handelt sich um die Frau Professorin Laura Fasanaro. Und ich darf Ihnen sagen, Frau Laura Fasanaro ist studierte Historikerin. Sie ist aber tätig in einem Bereich, der in Italien ganz anders definiert wird als bei uns, der Politikwissenschaften, der aber viel umfassender ist. Unter Politikwissenschaften versteht man an Universitäten in Italien mehr nur als das, was bei uns Politikwissenschaften heißt und gelehrt wird. Da ist Soziologie, Sozialwissenschaften, Geschichtswissenschaften und viele andere Fächer eingeschlossen. Frau Fasanaro ist eine sehr ausgewiesene Expertin zu verschiedenen Bereichen der internationalen Beziehungen, der europäischen Integration, der europäischen auch Parteiengeschichte. Ich darf ein bisschen was berichten. Sie ist Mitglied des wissenschaftlichen Beirates, wo es darum geht, um Italien in der Zeit des Terrorismus, in der Zeit der Parteien, der Institutionen, der Gesellschaft und der öffentlichen Meinung. Italien war sehr stark von Terrorismus geprägt, vor allen Dingen in den 70er Jahren, wenn Sie an die Roten Brigaden denken, an die Brigate Rosse zum Beispiel, also das Gegenstück zur Roten Armee-Fraktion. Frau Fasanaro ist auch in einer italienischen Gesellschaft für die internationale Geschichte, wo es um Sicherheit geht, Sicherheitsfragen, Sicherheitspolitik. Sie ist Mitglied auch gewesen eines Forscherteams, das sich mit der Geschichte der Kommission der Europäischen Union befasst hat, also die Zeit von Jacques Delors, von Jacques Santer, also die Zeit Mitte der 80er Jahre bis Ende der 90er Jahre. Das war HISTCOM 3, ein International Network, wo sie sich speziell beschäftigt hat mit dem italienischen Politiker und späteren EU-Kommissionspräsidenten Romano Prodi, der von 1999 bis 2004 Präsident der Kommission der Europäischen Union gewesen ist. Sie ist auch Mitglied und aktiv gewesen im Rahmen des Berlin-Kolleg Kalter Krieg, BKKK, wie es heißt. Dort war sie Gastforscherin im Jahr 2017 zum Thema europäische Politik und Energie, Umweltfragen, aber auch Landwirtschaft und der Konnex zwischen diesen drei Feldern in der Zeit des Kalten Krieges und im Anschluss. Sie ist ebenfalls Mitglied eines internationalen Forschungsprojekts. Da geht es um Ex-Post, italienische Diplomatie, Expertenpolitik im Bereich der Wissenschaft, der Technologie in Italien, auch mit Blick auf eine präventive, multilaterale Diplomatie. Und erwähnen darf ich auch noch, dass sie Mitglied ist im Rahmen des Progetto di Ricerca di Interesse Nazionale, wo es um Italy's Grants for Research Projects gibt im nationalen Interesse. Hier geht es wieder um Fragen Italiens, der Zusammenhang zwischen Energiepolitik, Umweltfragen und Herausforderungen und das Entwicklungskonzept für nachhaltige Entwicklung. Das ist auch ein Thema Sustainable Development, das Frau Fasanaro sehr interessiert. An Publikationen darf ich erwähnen, dass Laura Fasanaro eine Expertin ist für die italienisch-deutschen Beziehungen, speziell Italien und die Deutsche Demokratische Republik. Dazu hat sie auch ein Buch geschrieben, das nicht nur auf Politik Bezug nimmt, sondern auch auf die Wirtschaft, auf den Handel, auf die Ideologie im Zeitraum der Entwicklung vom Grundlagenvertrag zwischen der DDR und der Bundesrepublik Deutschland und der Entwicklung bis Mitte der 80er Jahre. Weiter darf ich darauf hinweisen, dass es eine Monographie gibt zum Thema Energia Contesa, Energia Condivisa, la Francia, il problema tedesco e la questione carbonifera nei due dopoguerra. Viele Artikel darf ich erwähnen über Mythen und Perzeptionen, also Mythen und Wahrnehmungen von Europa in der Deutschen Demokratischen Republik. Ein ganz spannendes Thema, wozu ich sehr wenig weiß und mich freue über europäische Sicherheitspolitik und Verteidigung nach dem Vertrag von Amsterdam, der 1997 abgeschlossen wurde und 1999 in Kraft trat. Auch möchte ich erwähnen Themen wie Kontinuität und Transformation, unterschiedliche italienische Visionen zum Thema Entspannungspolitik in Europa, 3 Decades of Détente, Romano Prodi habe ich schon erwähnt, auch Aldo Moro, ein Opfer übrigens des italienischen Terrorismus der Roten Brigaden, und die deutsche Frage in der Entwicklung der internationalen Beziehungen, die Jahre 1963 bis 1972, oder Neither in one block nor in the other, weder im einen Block noch im anderen Block. Da geht es um Enrico Berlinguer und seine Vision vom Ende, von der Beendigung des Kalten Krieges. Und das führt mich gleich zum nächsten Thema. Frau Fasanaro hat auch gearbeitet über ein Thema, von dem wir wenig wissen, über Eurokommunismus. Das sind also Tendenzen gewesen in den 70er Jahren, wo sich die französischen und die italienischen Kommunisten losgelöst haben vom Kreml, von Moskau, von der KPDSU und eine eigene Vision eines kommunistischen Europas, losgelöst vom Sowjetkommunismus, entwickelt haben. Das ist auch ein Thema aus ostdeutscher Sicht. Dann die deutsch-französischen Beziehungen und das Kohleproblem im Kontext des Ersten und Zweiten Weltkrieges, von einem bilateralen Konfliktthema zu einer gemeinsamen Energiezusammenarbeit. Das möchte ich auch noch erwähnen. Ich schließe jetzt mit diesen Ausführungen zu den Publikationen. In der Lehre ist Frau Fasanaro sehr breit aufgestellt. Sie beschäftigt sich mit der Europäischen Union und der internationalen Politik, einer auch Global Environmental Governance, mit internationalen Beziehungen, mit der Geschichte der europäischen Integration, auch in forschungs- und methodologischer Hinsicht. Sie hat sich ebenfalls in vielen Bereichen der Lehre mit Italien und die Vereinigten Staaten beschäftigt, mit einer Geschichte einer lang anhaltenden Interaktion und auch mit der Frage des organisierten Verbrechens. Des organisierten Verbrechens und der Ökonomie des organisierten Verbrechens und sozialen Innovation. Sie sehen also ein sehr breites Forschungsfeld, das jenseits der klassischen Diplomatiegeschichte, jenseits der konventionellen, traditionellen Politikgeschichte sich befasst. Und heute werden Sie sprechen über Lesser-Known Challenges of European Politics in the 1990s, also wir reden über die Nachkriegszeit. Es geht um Sustainability, es geht um Climate Change in der Post-Cold War Landscape. Frau Uccia möchte auch noch einige Worte sagen, das übernehme ich gerne in Überleitung, weil Deborah Uccia hat sich sehr verdient gemacht im Aufbau der Kontakte zu Laura Fasanaro und auch sehr verdient gemacht in der Etablierung einer guten Erasmus-Partnerschaft, die wir jetzt noch verstärken werden mit der Università Roma 3 und der Universität Juli. Vielen Dank auch an Deborah Uccia.
So I switch into English as this presentation, as you can see, will be English. So first of all, Laura, for being here, thank you. It's really wonderful that you can come here. So actually I had prepared a presentation starting by publications, but I think I will have to improvise and to give you some general information about our guest, about her biography. So as you can see, she teaches at Roma 3, in English meaning Rome 3, so the third university of Rome. And yes, Roma is more than one university. 3 different universities, La Sapienza, Tor Vergata, and Roma 3, and not speaking about private university, Catholic university, American university. And as we said, she teaches European integration, history, and quite interesting European Union in global environmental governance. So something quite new, and I think your university is an exception. It's not so widespread as a teaching subject. She graduated from the University of Catania, in the southern part of Italy, in Sicily, with a work on Eurocommunism. So you can see she started working on this subject when she was a student. 5 years later, she got her PhD from the University of Florence. We were actually at the same university in different periods, with a dissertation on the Rhinish coal question as an international problem after World War I and World War II. So the problem of energy. before today's question, even before the First and the Second World War. Throughout her career, she has been visiting professor in Germany, for instance, at the Freie University of Berlin, and you see how important is internationalization in the profile of her research. She speaks Italian, of course, English, German, and she gave this afternoon a short presentation to students, even in German. And we are really very grateful for that. French and even a little Russian. Yes, so we are really impressed. Her main research interest, as we know, revolves around the history of European integration, history of Italian-German relations, but what I find quite interesting, and that's the last thing I will say, is the archives where you have researched. So you know for historians how important archives is, and just a short, actually not a short list, historical archives of the European Union, Florence, Stiftung Archiv der Parteien- und Massenorganisationen der DDR im Bundesarchiv in Berlin, Politisches Archiv des Auswärtiges Amtes, Helmut Schmidt Archiv und Willy Brandt Archiv und noch weiter, Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, Stasi-Unterlage, National Archives in London, Archives Nationales in Paris, Archivio Nazionale dello Stato, Rome, the Archive of the Italian Communist Party, Rome, at the Gramsci Institute, Bettino Praxis Archive, at the Foundation Praxis, always in Rome, and last but not least, the Julia Archive in Rome, at the Institute Stuzzo. So it is for us a very great pleasure that you are here. I leave you the floor for your presentation.
So, vielen Dank für diese Einladung. Ich möchte zuerst danken Professor Geller, Frau Lucia, die Kollegin, die mich eingeladen haben. Ich freue mich sehr, mit euch zu sein heute. And I switch to English because I feel much more comfortable with English. So, thank you also for the presentations. The subject I have prepared for today, for today's presentation, lesser-known challenges of European politics in the 1990s, the conundrums of sustainability and climate change in a post-Cold War landscape, summarizes a little bit the research project I have been working in the past few years. Namely, I came back to energy, which was one of the first topics, energy security matters, one of the first topics I have been working on, in a different perspective, namely looking at the European community and the European Union from within, from inside. It is this project of the European Commission, history of the European Commission, that actually led me to develop a deeper interest into how the European ECEU, European Community, European Union works, and what kind of role have its own internal institutions, beginning with the European Commission in certain key policy areas like energy policy and environmental policy. And I will better explain why lesser known challenges, because we all know the main challenges of the 1990s for post-Cold War Europe, but probably we know a little less, about the lesser known challenges. So the challenge of making a sustainability model for Europe, a new vision of Europe based on the nexus between energy policy and environmental policy, and climate change, which enters as a political problem, international politics, precisely in the 1990s. I would say late 1980s, early 1990s. So I begin with the beginning was this this assumption. I mean, or better say, the fact that I realized, looking into the records of the European Commission, that there is a new political conception in the 1980s that develops, that spreads out in Europe between the late 1980s and the early 1990s, which eventually intersected this modern environmentalism that dates back to the 1970s but revives in the second half of the 1980s, intersects other aspects and other policy lines and guidelines of European politics, beginning with the completion of the single market, the development of new consumption and production models, integration in science and technology, and I'm thinking of the making of the work of the Joint Research Council, the progress in space technology within the European Space Agency that I will mention later, as well as the making of European Environment Agency in 1993, and the growing international role of the European Community, EU, in the making of the European Union. So 1991, 1992, precisely when the European Union was being shaped during the negotiations for the Maastricht Treaty. So I realized at a certain point that there is probably an intersection between the debate, the discussion on modern environmentalism and these aspects, these guidelines, these processes going on in Europe. So a brief step back into some definitions of modern environmentalism. I will simply go back to John McNeill's definition given in The Shock of the Global, namely a new modern environmentalism since the 1970s, the Stockholm Conference of 1972, that is characterized on the one hand by the new awareness of global scale environmental challenges, the depletion of the ozone layer, the loss of biodiversity, and the very early studies on global warming. This dates back to the 70s, at least as a first awareness that new global environmental challenges, global scale environmental challenges were beginning. And at the same time, this is what John McNeill suggests, globalized environmentalism, namely the spread out, not only in Europe, but throughout the world, of a common awareness, environmental awareness, that developed into green parties, green movements, and in general, blossoming of NGOs and environmental organizations throughout the world. So these two aspects define in brief, according to one of the most important environmental historians, John McNeill, the phase of the 1970s. And I added here a little quote taken from an exchange between S.J. Holt, who was at that time advisor on marine affairs at the Fisheries Department of the United Nations, FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, who wrote at that time to Director General at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, 1978, talking about global warming. He said, I interpret the scientific literature as indication that the hypothesis of rapid deterioration is now respectable, and the probability of its truth significant or even high, which means that global warming was not yet studied and measured and assessed the way it is today at that time, but still, already in the 1970s, there was an idea that a major phenomenon, very different from other environmental phenomena in the past, environmental damages in the past, was happening. This was the first alert, the first warning given by scientists to politicians at that time. And this growing awareness of unprecedented environmental threats goes on and grows in the 1980s due to a number of reasons that I will try and explain later. Another point that I will touch is the enhancing institutionalization of environmental policies in Europe. Between the 70s and the 80s, the environmental ministries were born in European countries. Italy was a latecomer. Between 1983 and 1986, there was a reshaping of the environmental ecological ministry first, and then environmental ministry. Other countries have their own environmental ministry already in the 1970s. And 1973, the European Commission launches the first environmental action program. Even though environmental policy is not yet part of European community policies formally, it only becomes so with the Single European Act of 1986. So it takes a treaty status environmental policy. That's the background. These are some of the research questions, the main research questions I am currently working on. My research is not over, it's totally in progress, but I have been working on this aspect, so it's probably not as first but as second assessment. These are some of the research questions I'm currently working on. Well, first of all, what shape did this discourse on sustainable development and climate change as a political issue take in European politics after the end of the Cold War? So at a very critical time in European history where everything changes. The institutions, the perceptions of the future, the ambitions of single institutions like the European Commission, and of course the geography of Europe somehow, the political map of Europe. How were these two issues related to each other? Sustainability, sustainable development, and the discourse on the evolution, the change in production and consumption models, so economic models, social models, and sustainable development in Europe, and climate change. They go hand in hand in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and then at some point climate change as a political issue goes back into the background. It's like a descending parabola, descending curve in terms of political interest in Europe. This is a point that can be left for discussion, but I will go back on this. Now, how were the challenge of sustainable development and, respectively, the environmental threat of climate change perceived by EU institutions and governments? There is also a growing interest among some governments, beginning with the British one, for the issue of climate change as a political stake, with a big question mark already during the Thatcher administration, so already in the late 1980s, such a government, in the late 1980s, there was a big question mark. This global warming issue, how will it affect in the future our economies? Should we take the lead? Should we try and cooperate with the European community, or better leaving it into the environmental, namely very limited, area of environmental policy? And then where, respectively, the discourse on sustainable development and the debate on climate change circumscribed, limited to economic issues, the cut of CO2 emissions, or was there already the perception that there was a scale in global policy, that something would change in international politics, in multilateral institutions, that this would be a debate getting out of the economic let's say borders, the borders of economic theories, green economy, ecological economy, and would affect politics in a broader sense, even international politics? Well, the answer I anticipate is yes, I have an answer to this. It's definitely a broader debate. And then, the other point, being climate change potentially a new existential threat, like a nuclear war, like a nuclear accident, how did it affect the idea, the conception of security in Europe? Did it even affect the conception of security? To some extent, yes, but much later, not in the 1990s, only recently, in the past 10 years, climate change has become part of the global security agenda, not in the 1990s. Although, if we look into the records, the British record, some of the Italian record, but most of all the European Commission's record, you would find a clear reference to the nexus between climate change and security threats already in the late 1980s. And so the last point is related to the fifth one. Considering that other better known challenges like enlargement, institutional reforms, and the shaping of the EU foreign and security policy deeply affected European politics in the 1990s, were these challenges, environmental challenges, of any relevance, or it's just a construction? They were of some relevance, but not what we might expect, maybe. And here I'm going into the main challenges in post-Cold War Europe in the 1990s. Clearly, the end of bipolarism, the beginning of a unipolar phase, new forms and new challenges for multilateralism, and Europe's domestic challenges, that is, better say Europe's proper challenges, not only domestic ones. First of all, the enlargement to the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the related institutional reforms, a process of institutional reforms that begin with Maastricht and never ends until the Lisbon Treaty. It's always ongoing, putting a strong pressure on the institutional architecture of the EU, but also on political relations, because it's a constant negotiation from Maastricht to Amsterdam to the Nice Treaty to the debate on the European Constitutional Treaty 2002-2005 to the Lisbon Treaty. It's 15 years of constant attempts at adapting the European Union to the new context of a Europe at 27, potentially 28. And then the unexpected crisis, events, the war in Western Balkans with its different phases, the humanitarian crisis to which the European Union was unable to give prompt and efficient answer, the reshaping of Europe's relations with Russia, the reshaping of Europe's relation with the United States, EU's relations with the Third World. These are the main challenges that scholarly literature has been dealing with and continues to deal with, because there is much more to know and to discover about both the domestic and the external dimension of the European Union in those years. Research on the 1990s, late 1980s and 1990s is clearly still ongoing, and we are all lucky for that. So there are always new inputs. And so these are the two lesser known challenges I'm working on. That is, and it's also my first argument, is that we can maybe trace a new periodization in the history of European integration. We're talking about periodizations that begins in the mid-1980s with the Single European Act, let's say, or the launch of the Single Market Program. Which is also the time in which sustainable development as a concept and as a policy was officially conceptualized by the United Nations in the World Commission on Environment and Development, the Brundtland Commission and the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, 1987. And this same concept of sustainable development that includes intergenerational equity, using resources today with a view, letting a chance for new generations to have enough available resources. This concept of intergenerational equity is endorsed by the European community and the European Union in the wake of the United Nations World Commission on Environment and Development. And the second challenge, which is parallel in timing, is climate change becoming a political issue, an international politics issue. There is a history of climate change as an international politics. When I talk to my students, they often realize that we had not thought that climate action was not born with Greta Thunberg or the Fridays for Future, but that we can historicize the process. We can historicize the Green Deal. Some of the ideas, some of the points on the agenda of the Green Deal actually date back to the late 1980s in a different context, but in continuity. And so climate change came to be seen as a conundrum in international politics. By whom? By the European Commission, by the European Space Agency, with the upgrade in satellite technology that allowed for a huge enhancement in the monitoring of the phenomenon throughout the world, and by the governments. Some governments in Europe, I have not been working yet on other governments other than Italy, Germany and Britain, but I plan to go deeper into the government's position. But it certainly is a bigger question mark, because scientists who 10 years before were suggesting that something totally new was happening in terms of global warming, not only related to nature, after 10 years they were saying it's here, it's happening, we will see the effects in a few. Even if the effects at that time were a global warming in 50 years of 1.5 to 4 degrees. Scientific uncertainty. The monitoring systems were not so sophisticated as they are today, so scientific uncertainty was part of this discussion on climate change, because scientists did not deny scientific uncertainty, although they say, despite scientific uncertainty, this will happen. We cannot say exactly how, but this will happen. And so it's a political problem. So I suggest first that this periodization, that there is a new periodization in European integration that we can trace, new, alternative to the others, overlapping. Periodizations are tools. I'm saying this for students, of course, not for my colleagues. Periodizations are helpful tools, but they are not rigid. They change with the change in research, in historical research, and they help us understand. Did I already finish my time? No. So I'll go very quickly. I saw 4:56. So, okay, thank you. I'll go very briefly into the approach. So my education is I'm a researcher in history of international relations, international history, and I'm talking about environmental history. Now, it's interesting to see that international history and environmental history have been ignoring each other for many years. International history has been strongly focused on the history of the Cold War, and only few historians on both sides, like John McNeill that I talked before, Corinna Unga, who's the author, I switched to this, but yes, sorry, this is Corinna Unga, who has co-edited this book in 2010 with John McNeill. They say that the two historiographies have been like two ships passing in the night, dimly conscious of one another but unable or unwilling to engage each other. They have been virtually ignoring each other. Environmental history has been largely focused, even political environmental history, on local matters, on local phenomena, environmental phenomena. Local damage or transnational pollution also, but the international implications of global scale challenges like climate change, the depletion of the ozone layer, the loss of biodiversity, deforestation, these are all of a different scale, different kinds of problems, even for international politics. So more recently, with such books like Environmental Histories of the Cold War or the special issue of Cold War history in 2016, it's always the same period, between 2010, 2015, 2016, there have been a couple of interesting contributions on the interplay between Cold War phenomena and environmental phenomena, but it's still, here again for the students, a field of research open to many possibilities and many new lines of research. I think that's interesting. Quotes I can leave for discussion. If you want, we can go back. It's not so relevant to read the single quote, but maybe this is just to remind that the environment and Cold War history were two transnational phenomena. Environmental depletion and Cold War were two transnational phenomena which often led to people in Europe to ask themselves, to raise questions about environmental threats. The nuclear threats and climate change threats have become part of intertwined discussion and discourse, even politically. And another interesting point related to this growing literature on the interplay between the history of the Cold War and environmental history is that scholars are beginning to, have already begun, to look into the soft power potential of environmental diplomacy during the Cold War. How parallel discussions, parallel debates on the on environmental threats sometimes helped dialogue on security matters, other times, let's say, created a parallel context for negotiation into Cold War times. Now, I go into my second argument now, that is, in a sense, the center of the research I'm carrying out. Namely that within this periodization from the mid-80s to the 2000s, and in particular between 1987 and 1992, so the making of the single market, the passage from the Single European Act to the European Union, the Maastricht Treaty, we can identify three levels of integration, three new levels of integration. The first one is environmental policy integration, namely the idea launched by the European Commission that environmental policy should not be considered any longer as a separated policy area, on its own, separated from economic matters or social matters. And instead, on the contrary, the European Commission fostered with EIP, European Environmental Policy Integration, the idea that environmental problems, challenges, and costs should be included into the main sectors of the ECEU, namely energy policy, transport policy, agricultural policy, foreign policy, the external relations of the European Union, and transport policy, and tourism. Maybe I skipped tourism policy. So the economy and economic and social policies should be integrated into environmental policy and the other way around. This is the ground, the basis for the sustainable development concept into the European Union at this time in history, the one which led in 2001 to the adoption of the Agenda for Sustainability under the Prodi Commission, the commission led by Romano Prodi. Second, the new level of integration is the enhancement over the same time of scientific and technological cooperation, in particular the improvement of monitoring and forecasting models in research and analysis on climate change, on environmental change, climate change first, but also deforestation, the effects of deforestation, the loss of biodiversity, and the ozone layer. And here there is a huge effort made by the Joint Research Council at the European Commission, the new European Environmental Agency created in 1993, with the main goal of ensuring the consistency of environmental data, environmental measurement all throughout Europe. One of the big problems at this time, and most of all after the Chernobyl accident of 1986, was for the European Commission and DG 11, Environment, and DG 12, Science, Technology, Science, Research and Development. One big issue for them, both DGs, was to ensure that environmental depletion, environmental damage, be measured and assessed in a consistent way all throughout Europe. That these totally inconsistent data that came from national environmental ministries be monitored by a common environmental agency. And that's why the European Environmental Agency was born in 1993. In the debate on the making of the European Environmental Agency is particularly interesting because agency is a kind of is a tricky word. In German, it's Agentur. There was a debate on the powers of this agency. The parallel body was the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, in the United States, and the Environmental Protection Agency in the US is very powerful. So the idea of having another very powerful agency in Europe, the members of the government did not like it that much. So in the end, the Environmental Agency became basically a body able to collect all data and to systematize them, to put order in the data coming from the different member states. But there is an enhanced level of scientific and technological cooperation. And here I quote Directorate General DG 11, which is Directorate General Environment at the European Commission, DG 11. Lorenzian Brinkhorst, interviewed by Jan-Erik Meyer a couple of years ago, he says, I think we played a very important role there in the establishment of the European Environment Agency. It means because increasingly the discussion was, what are the facts about the environment. What are we talking about? Somebody says 1%, 1 grade increase, in others says 4 degrees increase. Who's right? Who's talking? In science, in scientific uncertainty, what are our reference points? And scientific uncertainty, again, is a main issue when these global scale challenges come to the fore. And he also says, I think it was also crucial because it established credibility of environmental legislation. Environmental legislation already existed at that time. Since the 1970s, the European Community began regulations to protect, to face water pollution and air pollution first. That was the first two environmental threats dealt with by the European Community. But there was a lot of resistance on environmental regulation, of course. So having a common European environmental agency was seen as a step forward. Well, you know, these norms are too erratic, too ideological, motivated, he says. When the idea of an environmental agency came, it came very much with the view, well, we should give a solid foundation to environmental policy at the European level. And here again we can go back on discussion. I outlined some of the points. These are taken from the records of DG 11, DG Environment at the European Commission, and DG 12, Science, Research and Development. The two are very much committed with sustainable development discourse, the global role and responsibility of the European Union to face these challenges, even in relation to the third world, and climate change as a global challenge. Climate change is always there. Climate change is already there, in a very surprising way for somebody who listens to climate action. I will try to shorten. The other interesting thing in this environmental integration policy is that it's not only about economics. In some of these documents, there is a vision, and there are references to the ethic aspects. Culture, religion, and history are important determinants of man's view and use of environment and nature. It is suggested to generate and point out ways to apply and exploit in national and community policy making, not least at the international scene, a comprehensive and systematic knowledge of local, regional, and global differences in man's view of and use of nature as a function of these parameters. The underlying intellectual and political debate in Europe on ecological thinking versus green economy, environmental economy, reflects in this document. Probably in the different versions. You might open one version in which probably some of the practitioners and experts that drafted them underlined the ethical aspects of reviewing the relationship between human beings and nature, human activities and nature. There is no plan B. The motto of today, in part, is read in those. And then there are other versions of the same record in which the win-win game between green economics and ecological transition is underlined, which is something different from ecological thinking. So moral, ethical references to social aspects also, you know, of environmental damage are in this record. Second level of integration, I mentioned before, scientific and technological cooperation. Here again, this is an input for discussion. I will go very, very briefly into saying why the European Space Agency's role in these years, in the same couple of years, 87, 92, is especially important. It's a time in which, and I had the pleasure to work also the ex-post project on Italian technology science technological diplomacy that Professor Guerra mentioned before, is a project which I had a chance to take part with Professor Burigana, David Burigana, and Marilena Gala from Roma Tre, David Burigana from the University of Padua. He's the expert in Italy on space diplomacy, techno-science diplomacy, with a focus on space diplomacy, and the interplay between climate policy, the rise of climate policy, the climate change debate, and the enhancement of space diplomacy this day is extremely important. I'm telling to the students, if you are planning to work in Europe and are interested in techno-science diplomacy or scientific cooperation, go and look into the ESA archive, European Space Agency archives, in Florence, at the Historical Archives of the European Union. They are open until the early 2000s or so. There has been a huge project, including an oral history project on the European Space Agency. And I found also, there is a lot of technicalities, but I found interesting things related to climate change, climate policy. They say, for example, this is 1988. 88 is even before the Maastricht Treaty. The Earth's environment, specifically the means to monitor and preserve it, are being increasingly recognized as matters of major concern. Mankind is now appreciating that his activities may be disturbing the delicate balance which determines his environment on all scales, from the local to the global. Linked to this environmental concern is the realization that the Earth has limited resources on which increasing demands are being placed. This is not an environmental NGO. This is the European Space Agency talking, which is different. Again, scientists now emphasize that Earth observation, this is when the Earth observation program was born, from space provides the only viable and cost-effective means of acquiring the necessary input data into their models, while also monitoring the conditions of the Earth on the local, regional and global scales. For example, satellite innovation that allowed to monitor the effects of climate change through the clouds on land changed completely the assessment of climate change. This happens in these days. So precisely in 1988, 4 major space program elements were identified for implementing this strategy and achieving European goals. What is the European Space Agency strategy? An environmental monitoring program, an Earth resources management program, an operational meteorology program, and a solid Earth program. And this is precisely the same time when, sorry, I'm trying to skip a little bit because I don't want to take too much time, but let me go to here. I'm not skipping everything, I'll go back for a minute, but just to give you an idea, while in Europe scientific and technological cooperation increased, thanks also to the cooperation between European Community and European Space Agency, that of course is not the same thing, but they collaborated. At multilateral level, 1988, precisely the same year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was set. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change created a system of constant monitoring, assessment, and negotiation on climate change that is in play since 1988, that has a juridical framework in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change signed at the Rio Earth Summit in June 1992, in which today we recognize as the COP, or COP summits. It's the conferences of the parties. The parties to what? The parties to the United Framework Convention on Climate Change. The IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, here you see one of the infographics of the assessment reports of the IPCC, monitors globally the constant development of global warming and its effects all throughout the world. And the very interesting thing about this body, created precisely in those years at the United Nations, is that it is not only made by scientists, it's made intergovernmental by scientists, diplomats, national officials. monitors and negotiates. So the climate governance, world governance, is very special. There is no other example like this. Because it's made through multilateral organizations, the IPCC, and a multilateral convention, the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, that discipline the constant assessment, scientific monitoring, and negotiation on global warming, with certain intermediate steps that are the assessment reports every 2-3 years, and the conferences of the parties, COPs, which is where negotiation reaches a higher level. So everything happens in these years. It's strange, it's fascinating. Everything happens in these years. This is the World Meteorological Organizations, the United Nations Environment Programme, and Mr. Bert Bolin, the first president of the IPCC, who was a Swedish meteorologist and immediately suggested this approach of the IPCC based on graduality, accuracy, and dissemination. Let the people know what was happening in relatively simple terms, but with scientific knowledge. Because climate change is very tricky. Everyone can tell anything. Everyone can deny in the face of scientific uncertainty. And one of the conditions included in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, which still today is in place, is that this system of governance works despite, even though there is scientific uncertainty. Because the global threat is recognized, so scientific uncertainty cannot be the excuse to deny it. That's the idea. It helps also, putting in perspective denial theories and climate change. When you see that since the 1980s, there is a worldly, multilateral recognized system of monitoring and negotiation on climate change. So I'll take really 2 minutes to finish my points related to my research. So basically my third line, and then we go back to discussion. Sorry. Yes. My second argument was these 3 levels of integration: environmental policy integration, the enhancement of scientific and technological cooperation, in particular the improvement of monitoring and forecasting models, and third point, that's my argument, the integration of sustainability and environmental diplomacy into the international agenda of the European Union. The newborn European Union, according to the European Commission, which is my main perspective now, then one has to double check with what the government thought, but there was an ambition to play a global role precisely in environmental diplomacy. And on this, I will show you another, very briefly, another quote. I realize now that I'm disordered with right. I realize now, so it's this quote here. Global issues. This is taken from the document named The Environmental Imperative. June 25, 26, 1990, it's an annex to the presidency conclusions of the Dublin European Council, the Environmental Imperative, 1990. In the section related to global issue, they say, the community and its member states have a special responsibility to encourage and participate in international action to combat global environmental problems. Their capacity to provide leadership in this sphere is enormous. The community must use more effectively its position of moral, not only economic, moral, economic and political authority to advance international efforts to solve global problems and to promote sustainable development and respect for the global commons. The atmosphere is a global common now, so it's related to climate change as well. In particular, the Antarctic, that's a special case, deserves special protection as the last great unspoiled wilderness, and so on. So, this is 1990, it's the presidency conclusions, it's the governments. It's a European Council summit, so it's the government suggesting that the European Union should take leadership in sustainable development models and environmental diplomacy. And I will add to this that the documents of the European Commission that I mentioned before, DG 11, DG 12, and the DG Energy as well, are totally consistent with this. There is always a section related to the global role of the European Union. And there is often a reference to the responsibility, the moral responsibility of the European Union as a region of developed countries towards the rest of the world for bringing solutions to global environmental problems. So my third argument, and I will finish here, is that the European Union that was born after the end of East-West conflict was marked by certain identity features of which sustainable development was part of. And it's both sustainability inside Europe, so an economic and social model of sustainable development inside Europe that included a reshaping of production and consumption models, the green economy, and a foreign policy model exporting sustainable development. The EU's assumption of responsibility for the monitoring and containment of environmental depletion, the EU's ambition to take a leading role in the building of global environmental governance, taking part in multilateral institutions, and an economic and social model in which the evolution of the single market was inextricably accompanied by a well-defined vision of sustainability. The single market is of inspiration to this concept, to this vision. Why? Because when the Single Market Program was launched and approved and included in the Single European Act in 1987, with the Single Market Program came also the awareness that enhanced liberalization, enhanced tourism, enhanced transport, enhanced energy use, growth, enhanced economic growth would bring inevitably environmental depletion. So the environmental policy should become an integral part, an integrated part of economic policy, because they forecasted further environmental depletion due to the single market. It was the price to pay. While we paid, we tried to, solve the issue before. And here I like to quote also Professor Geller's reference to Europeanization, to the different forms. It's a very inspiring essay on the different forms of Europeanization in the history of European integration, considering European integration as a level of integration, and Europeanization as a broader vision, a system of values, and so on. Maybe there is a new phase of Europeanization or a new level of Europeanization linked to sustainable development visions, in which climate change is part of the story, but, and I will end with this, and with a very, very last slide, a very sad part of the story, because, yes, that's my however. While the European Union is known today for being leading region in terms of climate action, it's definitely the region of the world in which climate action, climate policy has been more effective in terms of industrialized countries. At the same time, in the 1990s, we observed, or at least this is what I'm putting as an argument, a sort of descendant parabola, or declining trajectory in the interest for climate change, the discussion on climate change. While in the late 80s and early 1990s, there was a rising awareness of the threat of global warming and a rising political interest in it that coincides with the multilateral dimension of the IPCC and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and with space technology and the rest. In the second half of the 1990s, the discussion on climate change, on sustainability goes on. On climate change, the discussion, the political debate declines. Why? There are many reasons, and I'm trying to look and better develop this part of my research. Well, first is the Kyoto Protocol is basically a failure in political terms. The treaty signed, the Kyoto Protocol, the first multilateral agreement on climate change, on the cut of emissions, CO2 emissions, is signed in 1997, is ratified only in 2005, 8 years later, 8 years of CO2 emissions later. Secondly, the United States never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, and with the end of the Clinton administration, these two mandates in 2000s and the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, it became increasingly difficult for the European Union to discuss with the United States about climate change. And last but not least, events, 9/11, 2001, international terrorism. The threats, the existential threat of international terrorism becomes more important than anything else, and certainly more than climate change, which is waiting for a treaty, the Kyoto Protocol, to be ratified by all its member states. So I will finish here, and sorry if I took more time.
Many thanks. So you see, the applause is very strong. So many thanks for a really active, engaged, sustainable, dynamic, substantial lecture. Many thanks. I think you raised so many points. Just a very brief pickup of some points. You started with John R. McNeill and his article in Ferguson and Mayer, and the growing awareness for environmental challenges and climate change in the 1970s. Then you raised a lot of very important questions. You are talking about the unipolar phase. I think that's also a further explanation, failure of Kyoto and so on. The need for historization and periodization, it's a tongue breaker, of climate change, the scientific uncertainty still going on. Take also the pandemic and COVID-19, scientific uncertainty up to now. So interesting that you also mentioned these three levels of integration during the short phase of 87 to 92, and also the interesting interrelationship between climate change policy and space diplomacy. At the end, I asked myself if there is a kind of spillover effect and a strong proof for neo-functionalist theories on European integration if you take the environmental diplomacy, environmental policy into the stronger awareness of integration policy, EC, European Commission's policy. But I would not like to overstretch a comment. I think that also Deborah can pick up some points for her summary, and then we should go to the discussion. I have to add that Laura is very familiar with German. You can also raise your questions in German. You would like to answer in English, I think, or because of our tape recording. So again, from my side, thank you very much. I would have a lot of questions, but I think discussions by the students, by our audience, has to be a priority. So Deborah,
I will pick up just one point. I do not want to steal time from the discussion. So thank you again. It was fascinating in many ways. I think an enrichment for our students. What I found very interesting, what you said at the beginning, the two trains, parallel, they do not meet. Actually, environmental on the one side and on the other side, international relations are two distinct processes. So they are related, but not in research. They're treated as two objects of research. And I have the impression in many ways it's not only generally speaking of international relations, but also history of European integration. We focus on very different subjects, but only very few, I would say a couple perhaps of historians, and one more, but not so many in Europe, throughout Europe, have actually underlined the importance, the connection to these different subjects. And as you say, in the 80s, the precondition, the pre-Meiji, and even in the 70s. And we are accustomed to think about the subject as related in the last 2 decades, but not so. So we can historize it, and I think it's quite a very interesting approach. But I need time for the discussion now.
I think we should collect a first round of questions. Please don't hesitate to raise your hands and to ask questions. We should collect the first round of questions, please. It's possible also to ask the questions in German. So we have changed the camera team. It's now established. Daniel Deiche will be the first one, please.
What do you think, and in what way will the Green Deal of the European Union affect the competitivity of the economic of the European Union compared to global players like the USA or China, for example?
I think I could add a further point strongly related to this question. What about a comparative level of the history of climate change awareness, of a growing climate environmental policy diplomacy on a global level compared with Asia, People's Republic of China, India, Brazil, South Africa? Is this also important or necessary to put this in a global analysis in order to have the different levels of this different processes of starting awarenesses, of change of policy, etc.? Further questions, please. Please, Albin Ottmer, slowly and clearly, please.
I want to ask how the climate change denial was at the time. I mean, they obviously couldn't prevent those scientific initiatives from existing. However, how successful or how big were they and who were they?
Maybe we have a third question to Laura Fasanaro. If this is not the case, I would ask a further question. It's related to the aspect you mentioned, that Cold War historians ignored environmental history. That's a fact, and I think that's clear. We cannot say that this is not the case. But why? Why do you think Cold War historians denied this very important aspect of climate change and environmental history? Maybe I will try to formulate an answer. Maybe because for the US and for the Soviet Union it was not a topic. And maybe that's why we do not find in the files of US policy, foreign policy, diplomacy, or USSR policy, not really many files, not many documents on that. And maybe that's not an excuse, but it's an explanation why historians also came to the conclusion it's not important, but it was a misunderstanding. So it was important, but it was, I think, to a certain degree, really ignored. And this leads me to another question. You mentioned 9/11 and the awareness of, to build up, to set up a coalition against terrorism. Maybe that we can put in a periodization of this history of climate change awareness and environmental policy events which overshadowed the debates on climate change issues and which became stronger from a, let's say, public space economy of debates, media and so on. I remember well when we had the debate on COVID-19 and the pandemic, when the total Ukrainian war broke out, you got the impression that pandemic has disappeared. And everything was focused on this war. And there was no strong ongoing debate how we can overcome this pandemic and face the consequences of the pandemic. It was so a change of kind of economy of public attention on that. So, full stop.
Thank you. Shall I answer?
Yes, please. to all the points.
Yes, so I will start with the first question, with Daniel's question. I don't want to elude your question, but to be honest, I'm not in a position to, I'm not able to forecast the consequences, or I could do that, but not scientifically, because I'm a historian. So it's difficult for me to forecast the next consequences of the Green Deal. However, the Green Deal is, I take your questions very seriously, because it's where I started. I didn't start from the Green Deal, I started before the Green Deal working on this. But I think that we can historicize through this research the Green Deal and this big investment of this big project and vision of the ecological transition in the European Union today. I honestly think that this is the history, that from the 80s, it's the beginning of what has become the Green Deal. And what I'm also trying to look into is the people that have constantly working. There is a generation, there are two generations now, of officials at the European Commission who often came from science. We were talking about this yesterday. They were chemists, they were biologists, they were meteorologists like Bernd Bolin, and started working at the political agenda of sustainability inside the European Commission, eventually bringing their expertise, scientific expertise, into a political agenda. I don't know what will happen in the future, but what I can say is that the Green Deal was in 2019, when it was launched in December 2019 by the first von der Leyen Commission. It was a very ambitious plan, but it was not at all out of the blue. As a historian, had 40 years history and 40 years background with this back and forth in terms of public debate. I would say, always, I try not to talk about the future, but to the present, yes. As a historian, we can try to reconstruct the context of the present as well, or the recent past, that the pandemics, the COVID-19 crisis, has speeded up the Green Deal, definitely, because the post-pandemic recovery plan, the Next Generation EU, uses the typical instrument of the European Union of conditionality to eventually steer the funds for post-recovery into the ecological transition, towards the investments on ecological transitions. In terms of economic growth, I'm not an economist, but what I see, it's very interesting, and I go also into Professor Geller's next suggestion, the other countries in the world, the big powers, China, India, the United States, they've grown much more than the European Union in the past decade, and they have polluted much more than the European Union in the past decade. So I ask myself, did they grow less full stop and polluted less, or did they grow less also because there is a regulation, there is a climate policy inside the European Union since the Kyoto Protocol? The European Union has been implemented the Kyoto Protocol, whereas the United States have not. So definitely the ambitious program has been speeded up, and in terms of economic growth, I think this is the question mark, but I don't have the answer, so I want to be clear with that. Comparative levels of climate diplomacy, that's a main issue, definitely. Comparing what the European Union does, even in the 1990s, with the other countries. I take this suggestion as an input to clarify something that I have no time to clarify. It's related to climate governance. I try to explain how it works. Now, there is one thing that I did not say, namely that since 1992, so the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the signatories to the convention have agreed on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility for climate change, which means that they have all agreed, the North and the South of Europe, the Third World, that there is a common responsibility. Every country, every person, every human being in the world has a responsibility for climate change, so every government. However, is a differentiated responsibility. clearly the most industrialized countries are more responsible. How has this affected governance? Very much. The Kyoto Protocol includes a list of two lists of countries. The countries that must comply with a certain cut in emissions, in percentage emissions, with national percentages. But the countries that must comply, which are the developed countries, which is the European Union countries, which is the United States, which is Canada, which is Japan, and the countries that should comply with, that's the third world, the less developed countries, LDCs. And among these countries there's China in the 1990s. And that's the main reason why the United States, under the Clinton administration, signed the Kyoto Protocol but never ratified it. Al Gore went to Kyoto, December 1997, knowing that he would sign a treaty that the Senate would never ratify, because a couple of weeks before, the Senate had approved the Bayet-Hagel resolution here. It's cross-party, it's a Democrat and Republican resolution. It's agreed, it's transversal, parties, approved by the Senate, which stated that the United States should not agree to take any engagement in any agreement that included different kinds of treatments among different countries. So on the one hand, they had agreed to the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, but when it came to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, they did not want to. And the main reason was that China was among the less developed countries. They knew that this principle would, over time, affect the international competition between the two countries. So a very interesting point that I have not studied, but now there are new, how is it, I'm missing the name of the US historian who is working more on climate policy in the 1990s in the US. But a consistent part of the Clinton Acts, and these have been declassified. There are some ongoing studies, very interesting one on this. Very interesting is to see the internal debate in the United States in the 1990s. I think we have a lot to learn from that internal debate, because there is continuity with the present. And China has been growing without rest from the 1990s. So it's a 20 years discussion in which climate change has been suddenly forgotten or overshadowed by terrorism and the rest. So again, I cannot say it scientifically, but probably one of the reasons, to go to your next question, why in the first decade of the 2000s international terrorism has become the most important thing in the world and climate change disappeared, is not because we stopped polluting or emitting or climate change stopped, it only worsened. But it's because we are waiting to see what happens with the Kyoto Protocol. And while we wait, let's forget about it. Or at least, let's put it aside. On this point, however, I think there is another reason why for this descending parabola. It's events, it's a new threat, it's somehow the trend of modern world, even communication, to spread information and alerts on the next threat, on the current threat, and then go immediately to the next one. But it's not just this. If we look at the European Union signs the Kyoto Protocol and ratifies it. Every country of the European Union ratifies it. And this is experienced as a success. It's perceived as a success in the European Union, even if the Kyoto Protocol enters into force when it is already dead, 8 years after. It has no more sense from the scientific point of view, from the climate change point of view. Or at least it's very much mildly diluted, the effect. But the European Union countries began immediately. So there was an effect in Europe. However, the early decade of the 2000s, is another extremely interesting indicator. It's not only 9/11, and the concept. After 9/11, there is a new conception of security, a new strategic doctrine in the United States, 2003, preventing war. And in Europe, European Security Strategy of 2003 endorses this idea of that the main threats to security are rogue states, international terrorism, weapons of mass destruction. Climate change is not even mentioned. Although in the records of the Commission that I have mentioned before, I did not show you, but the nexus security, climate change, is always there. Here I mentioned somewhere that the nexus security climate, no, that's a different story. Sorry, I wanted to show you. The climate sustainability nexus and the climate security nexus is part of this early phase of climate policy. Then, 10 years later, it disappears, this nexus. You don't find it in the European Security Strategy, you don't find it in the update of the European Security Strategy 2008. You only find it for the first time in 2016. Here, European Union Global Strategy 2016, there you find some reference to climate change as a security issue. You find the linkage between the two. So probably is the George W. Bush administration that was less committed than the Clinton administration. It's the Senate, it's the rising conflict with China in terms of international commercial competition with China, is 9/11, but it's also in the EU enlargement. Enlarging and deepening are not always easy together, and climate policy is a huge deepening. And in spite of this, the European Union ratifies the Kyoto Protocol and implements it. So it's not in the position to push forward the others, to push for further climate policy. But, and Prodi, during one of his interviews, said also that there was a big effort made by the Commission to convince Russia to adhere to the Kyoto Protocol. So the European Union, I don't want to be rhetoric, but it made its job. Simply the conception of security internationally did not allow, or did not include climate change. And for young students might be crazy to hear that 40 years ago we knew that it was a security threat, 20 years ago we forgot, and now we go back to the security threat of climate policy. That's very interesting, I think. And then, sorry, there was another question, climate denial at that time. Who were they? I don't have a full answer to this because I don't know exactly where the denials. There is not much literature on the deniers, and I think it's a very interesting field. And maybe some of the researchers, ongoing researchers on the European Parliament and on the Green parties or the NGOs can explore more about the discourse, the counter discourse on climate change. So I have not been working on this. What I can say, however, is that scientists at the IPCC and politicians were clearly aware that this was a political issue, namely that the objective scientific uncertainty of climate models could become a political issue. That's why Bert Bolin, as a meteorologist, but as first president of the IPCC, said clearly, he wrote a very interesting biography, self-biography. If you want to write a memoir of Bert Bolin, it's very interesting. He suggested this strategy of the IPCC based on first graduality. If we push too hard for climate action, there will be a setback because it's a very dangerous issue and we cannot explain it fully. So we need graduality. One, we need accuracy. So scientists need to tell the truth, but not overemphasize what they cannot prove. So accept scientific uncertainty Otherwise, the IPCC might be delegitimized. He was afraid that the IPCC might become a puppet in the hands of some of the governments, and that scientists might be delegitimized in their role of assessing models, because clearly the tools were not as much sophisticated as we have today. And third point in the strategy of backballing, dissemination. Trying to explain simply what is the most complicated thing in the world, that is climate science. And for historians, it's, if I may confess, I go into the NASA Kid website when I have doubts about climate. I started at least with NASA Kid, and then I started reading other books. It's very complicated. But making it simple for the people meant also educating people to think in terms of a calming threat. I don't know if you have seen the movie Don't Look Up. That's clearly a kind of metaphor of climate change. Very, very last point. Cold War historians ignored environmental history. Why? That's another big question. I think it's related to, I can find two reasons and we can find many more. First reason is that not only Cold War historians ignored environmental historians, but environmental historians also ignored Cold War historians, which means that these two disciplines have self-nurtured themselves with their own literatures. And environmental history can be very local-based. Internationally, Cold War history tends to look in the broader picture and forgets the local picture sometimes. But there is also another reason, and I think it is related to the nexus between climate and security, the non-nexus between climate and security. Cold War historians have been working a lot on a notion of security that is the traditional military concept of security. Whereas the ongoing debate on global security, which includes environmental security, economic security, that dates back to the 1970s, has remained mostly a matter for history of ideas, history of concepts, history of ideas, or international history has looked into the traditional defense security notions. And in fact, in the history of European integration, for the 1990s, there is a large debate on common foreign and security policy, which has nothing to do with sustainability or climate change, but refers to the traditional concept of defense and security as military security. Actually, in the 1990s, the very notion of security takes manifold notions. Environmental security, human security was born at the United Nations as a new concept. Energy security. Yeah. I think international history has been a latecomer in recognizing how broad the concept of security has become, and environmental history did not at all take part in this debate. So the two have remained apart somehow.
Many thanks for very convincing, substantial answers. We have 6 to 6, so a short round of last questions. If you have ones, please. First, Dr. Leonard, then my colleague Jörg Bölling, and the third one is, yes, Mrs. Nowakowski. So we start with Mr. Leonard. You can ask in German. So
ja, ich frage mal auf Deutsch. Ich möchte mal ausgehen von den jetzigen Ergebnissen der internationalen Klimapolitik. Lauter. Und da muss ich konstatieren, dass sie gescheitert ist. Wir haben jetzt am Nordpol 10 Grad. Das heißt, das Polareis ist auf Dauer verloren. Wir haben immer mehr gefährliche Wetterereignisse und ich könnte auch eine ganze Liste vortragen, die spare ich mir jetzt. Also gescheitert, okay. Was meinen Sie? Wussten die Experten in den 90er Jahren, wie idealistisch und unrealistisch ihre Klimastrategie ist und wie ist das dann einzuschätzen, dass sie trotzdem diese Klimapolitik betrieben haben? Und mir erscheint manches, also vom Soziologischen her, etwas gespenstisch. Da findet eine internationale Klimakonferenz statt mit Tausenden von Teilnehmern und die erzeugen gewaltige Mengen an CO2, das man eigentlich besser nicht verbrannt hätte, also man nicht erzeugt hätte. Das erscheint mir wie der Tanz auf der Titanic. In Wirklichkeit werden die Probleme nicht wirklich wahrgenommen, man tut nur so.
Vielen Dank für die Frage, die auch ein bisschen ein Kommentar war. Ja, please.
Ah ja, vielen Dank. Auch meinerseits sehr interessant. Meine Frage betrifft die Interdisziplinarität dieses Projektes. Es ist ja im Grunde genommen einerseits politikwissenschaftlich, historisch, das ist ja schon mal für sich gesehen interdisziplinär, aber es kommen auch die Naturwissenschaften hier zu Wort. Sie sprachen ja schon von der Weltraumbehörde, wie sie im Deutschen, der europäischen heißt. Also da ist ja tatsächlich die Physik, die Astrophysik und anderes gefragt. Wie lässt sich das mit Blick auch vielleicht auch auf ältere Epochen beziehen? Es gab in Göttingen so einen Graduiertenkolleg Umweltgeschichte, wo man sich mit Dingen beschäftigt hat wie der kleinen Eiszeit 1570 etwa bis 1700.
Wer ist der?
Göttingen.
Ah, okay.
Genau, Göttingen. Jakubowski-Thiessen war zum Beispiel als Neuzeithistoriker dabei und so weiter. Lässt sich dieses Projekt, wie Sie es jetzt vor Augen geführt haben, vielleicht auch für frühere Zeiten fruchtbar anwenden, indem man sagt, da sind jetzt sozusagen Bohrungen im Eis, wo es noch vorhanden ist, möglich, um gewissermaßen das Ganze rückverfolgen zu können und dann auch die menschliche Komponente noch besser darstellen zu können. Denn vor der ganzen Industrialisierung hat es zwar ja auch Schwankungen gegeben, aber in anderer Weise. Insofern wäre das ja die Kontrastfolie, um den Klimadeniern, Leugnern, wie man ja auch hier sagt, klarzumachen, hier hat sich doch etwas verändert. Sehen Sie da auch dann Möglichkeiten? Oder ist es, weil das Beweismaterial so erdrückend ist, auch überhaupt nicht mehr notwendig sozusagen?
Direkt dazu. Jörg Bölling ist ja ein Theologe und Historiker. Wie weit ist eigentlich auch die Ethik? Die Ethik und wie weit sind auch die Kirchen in diesem Klimawandeldiskurs zu verorten? Ich denke zum Beispiel an die Europäische Bischofskonferenz, die es seit Anfang der 80er Jahre gibt und die auch das Geschehen sehr aufmerksam verfolgt und sich auch ein Urteil bildet. Also Kirchen, die Religionen, ihr Verständnis zur Umwelt. Wir haben schon mit Frau Germer eine Person, die sich mit dem Verhältnis von Mensch und Tier und Mensch und Umwelt beschäftigt, auch aus Sicht der Religionen. Also man könnte es ja multidisziplinär anlegen, mehr als nur interdisziplinär oder megadisziplinär. Frau Nowakowski, noch bitte Ihre Frage.
If you don't mind, I would like to ask in English, maybe that's also easier for you to understand. You said that the countries in the global north are way more responsible for climate change than countries in the global south.
Okay, yes.
Of course. And they are, like, countries in the global south are way more vulnerable for the effects of climate change, and they are in debt, but there is like this not very new but quite common recently concept of debt for climate swaps. So instead of repaying the countries that you owe the money, you can invest it into climate projects, and then you don't owe the money back to the countries instead. And this is also a concept like the COP in 2022 urged countries to do that, to offer that. And you said you're a historian and you don't really talk about the future, but from the like Tokyo Protocol and all the other agreements, like from this perspective, do you think this concept can work according to how countries acted in the past?
Please.
Can I start from this last question?
Yes, of course, yes, of
I
course.
think I can also accompany this with a... Right. Because these are all questions that refer to the other, so probably you know all this, there were two main agreements in global climate governance, the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. And probably there are many differences between these two agreements, but probably the most evident one is that the Kyoto Protocol tried to impose emission cuts from above, whereas the Paris Agreement asks for each government to make their own plans to reach the common goal of not increasing more than 1.5, maximum 2 degrees, and so on. So this is the main difference in the approach, which means also that there is no more this list of two groups of countries, but each country does what they can do in terms of planning, but then they commit themselves to respect the plan. The other new things, innovation of the Paris Agreement that tried to rebalance the failure of the Kyoto Protocol is climate finance, a clear reference to the fact that any possible tool, any possible instrument, including the ones that you mentioned, made to help the less developed countries help themselves in facing the hardest effects of climate change should be taken. And that without climate financing you cannot do anything. You cannot simply impose emission cuts. So there was a big correction in terms of it's a totally different approach. And I agree with you that climate finance is an essential part of climate action today. Definitely so, if not being an economist, it's totally part. I don't know if I can call it the debt restructuring in the way you described it, or the swaps. It's a way also to have the full participation of less developed countries, not only receiving money, but learning how to invest and reinvest in, and here I use another slide, mitigation and adaptation projects. I hope I got all the points that my colleague suggested. I'm not sure if I'm missing anything. You tell me. I start from climate policy failed, Simon. I think yes, climate policy failed, but climate policy was not meant to solve the. One thing that one needs to clarify is that climate change is not a threat that can be faced in terms thinking of solving it. There is no solution to climate change. Even if we had started, even if the Kyoto Protocol had been implemented since the first day one by the United States and by China and by India, we would have different effects, lower effects, milder effects, but there is no solution to climate change. Climate governance works based on these two concepts, mitigation and adaptation. There is no solution. So it failed in implementing the right measures to mitigate the phenomenon, but there is no solution. I don't want to be, I agree with you that it was a failure, the Kyoto Protocol. I agree with you that this declining trajectory that I described is awkward, is unthinkable. It's a phenomenon in itself because you knew that this could happen and you let it happen. But then we should not forget that climate change is being described by political scientists, historians, economists, and so on as the wicked problem, the worst and most complex problem in politics. And that it was the first time. I don't want to justify anything, but it's really, we are seeing now the effects. In the 1990s, people were still thinking they could do mild adjustments. even today we are discussing of the mild Green Deal and the adjustment that we can do to the Green Deal approved 5 years ago, 5 years later. Timing is another big issue related to climate change as a political issue. Timing. The fact, for example, the Montreal Protocol that in 1987 dealt with the depletion of the ozone layer and stated that chlorofluorocarbons should be first reduced and then banned, was a success. The ozone layer has been almost totally restored and it was a success. Now in 1990, 1991, 1992, these people, they were made wrong, but they thought they could do like the Montreal Protocol initially. So just cutting emissions would work, maybe. Because the alternative was the U-turn of the big boat, the U-turn of the Titanic. And the European Commission, there is a record in the G11 that says we should first accelerate the big ship and then do the U-turn. And the U-turn coincided chronologically with the Kyoto Protocol. So in 1992 they thought they could start and then accelerate, but then they slowed down. And the reasons why they slowed down, however sad for us as you and me might be, are very fascinating for historians, because it's a big question mark. What happened in the early 2000s that made the ship slow down instead of U-turn? It's a shatter, it's a total failure. I don't know. Yes, it's a failure. But historically, it's a phenomenon in itself. So I cannot only think of hiding under the carpet the problem. It's really complex. Some people were more aware, some institutions were more aware. It's global acting against an existential threat that you don't see immediately the effects. Scientists knew that that today we would burn. But they have to convince politicians that it's not in 100 years. It's not in, no? And even today it's the same. The fact that we can still, turn the wheel on and nothing really happens, other than,
Because politicians think in legislations. That's one of the problems, I think.
It's part of the complexity, the timing, the fact that you have the disaster coming and you don't see the disaster. Somebody sees it, somebody's not. In the movie I mentioned before, Don't Look Up, there is this interesting different reactions. Scientists panic at the beginning and then they become calm because they are resigned. They know that this would happen. Politicians, they deny until the end and then they panic. It's exactly the opposite. And that's the IPCC. It works, so it's fascinating to see how it works, because science and politics it's the first experiment, no? I try to be good with human beings, but I totally agree with you. And then, yes, the church, this is already, it has to be studied much more. It has to be studied much more in an interdisciplinary approach. I'm totally weak at political science theories. I'm trying to reconstruct in a historical perspective sustainable development, which is a matter for economists. No, it's also a matter for historians, because there are political agendas and I can put them in a certain agenda and look at them in a certain political agenda. So I can name sustainable development according to political issues. In 1988, then in 1992, then in 2001, it changes somehow. And in Italy, Luigi Piccioni is one of the environmental historians. Was Luigi Piccioni? Piccioni. He's Colomba. He's a very he's a historian of the first generation of environmental historians in Italy. Very much committed with ecological thinking. So an approach that is of traditional environmental history, but he has issued one of his, there's an interesting essay on the church, and it's not the only one, in the book edited by Wolfram Kaiser, Jan-Erik Meyer on international organizations and global environmental policy that I quoted before, another essay. He has written and he has published also in this book. But it's a huge field. I'm telling to the students, we need to understand also why, as human beings, we are experiencing such a huge existential threat today, and it overlaps with other existential threats, nuclear weapons and so on. But understanding also helps killing fear sometimes.
Dear Laura, many thanks. It was a very strong presentation. Very strong presentation, and also a great discussion.
Thank you so much for your questions.
Exactly. I would also say this, thanks for coming, thanks for raising questions, and also thanks to our camera team making possible a wonderful tape on your lecture and discussion. Many thanks, and you have to come again to Hildesheim. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you very much.